Hello again, AP Euro students. I'm here coming to you on this lovely day from my backyard, and I figured today would be a good day to talk about the rise of fascism in Italy, specifically under the power and leadership of Benito Mussolini. So, this is a time period that is really, really fascinating to people for many reasons, because both Hitler and Mussolini managed to bring underneath their control so many people. Entire countries bowing to their whim. It seemed like these were some of the most powerful and dangerous and frightening men that have ever lived. So Hitler and Mussolini in Germany and Italy, and then you have Joseph Stalin, who was not allied with them, but as a communist dictator in the Soviet Union. These 2 decades, the 20s and 30s, make for a very interesting geopolitics because the wars that will happen, the war that will happen in that starts in 1939 is going to kill more people than anyone has than any war ever before in history. And interestingly enough, it really seemed like just a handful of men were at the helm of the leadership of this war. So we want to understand, how is it that a leader like Mussolini or Hitler can rise to power? What do they do exactly that gets people to willingly hand over their rights, their liberties to men like this? What tactics do they use? So today we're going to be looking at specifically Mussolini in Italy. So under chapter 26, you're going to want to scroll down and find the chapter 26 reading packet. And we are specifically going to be using this one on page 11, called The Doctrine of Fascism by Benito Mussolini. But before we start, I want to tell you a little bit about Mussolini and how he operates and what exactly are these extreme politics and what exactly is fascism. So, in history, some people, some historians wonder, did Europe really have totalitarian states? I mean, when we think of totalitarianism, what's really interesting is that it's the idea that one dictator actually controls every aspect of the country and the people who live in it. But what's interesting about this is that these strongmen, these dictators, they often rose to power through democracy itself. Not like pure democracy, but sort of a corrupted, bastardized version of it, but democracy nonetheless. Hitler and Mussolini, to a certain extent, were both chosen by the people. They wouldn't have had the power they had if the people hadn't, in a way, elected them or chosen them in some way. Not everybody, certainly, but enough people to support them. So what's really interesting about this time period is that mass politics was fairly new to Europe. Um, and yet, because the war creates conditions that make people distrust democracy, people then look to alternatives to democracy. They want a strong man, someone who's going to solve the problems in the country. So it's interesting to note that this newly franchised mass of society decides that democracy isn't really working. It's not exactly efficient. We talked about this in the last lecture about how the Western democracies really struggle during a time of crisis, and they want someone who's actually going to fix the problems, not just stand around and talk about them. And so this new electorate is going to move towards radical extreme politics. So this is for several reasons. For one, you have a class division and a gender division. Men and women seem to view this differently. You've also got the decline of the middle class. This is due to the war creating massive amounts of poverty and unemployment, but also a certain amount of people who profited from the war. So this creates a smaller, shrinking middle class. Another interesting development or phenomenon that happens after World War I is that many people believe women's rights, for the most part, would be expanded after World War I. And in some places they were, like in the United States and in Britain. But in the rest of Europe, actually, women's rights seem to take a back seat. Many of them were forced to leave the jobs that they had, and assume the traditional roles of women once again. There were even harsh and strict laws passed against things like abortion, and birth control access was denied to many women. This is probably due to the fact that so many people had died during World War I that it seemed unintuitive, to say the least, to reduce the population. So, women's rights really they don't get the expansion that we believe they get after World War One. Maybe in America they do, but not everywhere else. So anyway, people start to look towards either communism, which is on the left wing, or fascism on the extreme right wing, in order to solve, the crisis in their home country. Even the United States starts to question the efficiency of democracy when it becomes pretty clear that the Depression isn't going away anytime soon. And yet, strong men like Mussolini and Hitler, they end up somehow putting people to work. Now, is it really all it's cracked up to be? I mean, after all, when I say putting people to work, they were still working for starvation level wages and had no rights or freedom of any kind. Um, so it was very it was a very twisted reality that people were living in at the time and that people were comparing themselves to at the time. But what exactly is totalitarianism? Well, in a modern totalitarian state, you have a single leader and a single political party, and they seek the active commitment of citizens. And how they seek it is through propaganda, and also through coercion, through force. So there's high speed communication. Back then, they did not have Twitter, they didn't have social media at all, or even the internet or email, but they had radio and they had the movies. The silver screen, the theaters where people would go. It wasn't like people had uh, TVs yet, as well as posters, and then as schools as well were used as places to spread propaganda. Teachers were forced to teach the state propaganda. You have the domination of all aspects of life. Your rights, your civil rights are essentially non-existent. There is no freedom of press or religion or speech. People can't just come and go as they please. In fact, the very notion of individual freedom under a totalitarian state is non existent because it comes second to the collective will of the people. In other words, you as an individual don't matter. Your individualism is actually robbed of you anyway because everybody is taught to think the same thing and say the same thing and believe the same thing and act the same way. And everyone's being taught to believe the same politics. So, your right to think for yourself is taken away. Therefore, your individualism doesn't matter. What matters is the collective will of the people, and the collective will of the people is actually determined by the dictator. It is a dictator who decides what everyone's going to do and think and say. It's also a police surveillance state, meaning that there are spies everywhere, constantly listening, watching. If you say anything, you could end up being arrested. If you say anything that someone reports you for saying anything that is critical of the government. You might think of places like this today as like North Korea, for example, but to a large extent, fascist Spain, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, all of these countries, and even the Soviet Union, all these countries take on these characteristics. The word totalitarianism actually was first used by Mussolini himself to describe what fascism is. So let me explain a little bit about what these extreme politics are. This is a spectrum. Okay, it's called the political spectrum. And take a look at it. Now, I'm not saying that the spectrum is right or wrong, but it is about how many people define the traditional political spectrum. In the middle, you have the moderates. These are people who are neither left wing nor right wing. They consider themselves centrists. So, as you guys know, liberals are more on the left wing and conservatives are more on the right wing. This is true of any country that you're talking about. When you have liberals, then you have liberals to the left, conservatives to the right, and you'll notice on this spectrum, liberals and conservatives are called either right of center or left of center. And these are, in Europe, for example, the conservatives are often people who favor a sort of more traditional structure. Liberals are those who favor a constitution and civil rights, and often, socialists who want, for example, the government to take care of the people, the working class people more. But now, more importantly, look at the extremes of the spectrum. Look at the extreme right and the extreme left. To the far left, you have what are called radicals. Radicals would be, in this case, the communists. Now, this first takes root in Russia or the Soviet Union, as you know, and communism really starts as a way to try to get rid of inequality and get rid of poverty, essentially, overthrow the proletariat and redistribute wealth evenly. This is a very radical notion, and it goes very much against what the established order is. In fact, they overthrow the Tsar, they overthrow the nobility in Russia. So on the very far left, we have communism. However, on the very far right, as you can see, and I'm sorry, but my video here is sort of covering it up. On the very far right, you have reactionary politics. Now, we've learned about reactionary politics, but we know that reactionary politics often means a sort of violent reaction. It's when often involves radicals sort of revolutionizing or revolting, and then the conservatives react to that, often by crushing the revolution or revolt. These are often people who do come from or support some sort of established order with official decrees of religion, of state religion, state education. They also do believe in ownership of private property. So that's why they are not communist, because communists don't believe in the ownership of private property. And so often on the far right, we think of the fascists. So I have here the Nazi flag and the fascist Italian flag, which are sort of covered up by my video, but I have a better image coming up here. Okay, now, some people do not agree with what I'm about to say. Often the people who don't agree are the people who are on the extreme or radicals of the political spectrum. Many people believe that this spectrum is incorrect. And the reason why is because it displays communism, or I should say, far left and far right, as being polar opposites of each other, meaning like you would think like the two really don't have much in common. But that's actually not really true. Many historians believe in this. It's called the horseshoe theory. And the horseshoe theory is, if you take this line and bend it like a horseshoe, you get this instead. You still have the moderates, and you also have those who are to the left and the right, meaning the conservatives and liberals are still to the left and the right. But you'll notice what happens when you take a straight line and you bend it like a horseshoe is that the ends are actually much closer together than they are to what's in the middle. You have the radical left and the radical right are, still sort of separate from each other, right? If you look over here. But take a look at the extreme left, which would be, for example, the Soviet Union, and the extreme right, which would be, for example, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. When you bend it like a horseshoe, you notice that the two actually come very close. In fact, in a horseshoe, the two ends nearly touch. That's because they're actually very similar. Both of them involve some sort of totalitarian dictatorship. Both of them involve a loss of rights, violent dictatorship, militant dictatorship, and complete and total state control over every aspect of people's lives in that country. Both of them involve a complete lack of civil rights. Things like freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion are not allowed in any of these, in either of these, right? So the extreme left and the extreme right are really much farther away from the middle than they are from each other. They're actually, even though they're on polar opposites, they're actually very similar. So let's go back to Italy then and see why this type of power rose up. So World War I has a major impact on Italy. You'll remember that Italy had actually switched sides during the war. They had originally been allied with Austria and Germany, but when Britain offers them a secret deal, they switch sides because they want to gain some land that they really secretly have wanted from Austria for a long time. So when World War I ends, they're technically on the winning side, which is good, but they also feel a little bit alienated, and switching sides and gaining land did nothing to deal with the economic problems that were in Italy to begin with. So the government was not able to deal with any of these problems. There were riots and strikes. The peasants of Italy wanted land that was still being held by the nobility. Remember that Italy is a kingdom, which is what it became after it unified. So since the government seems unable to deal with the economic problems, on top of that, those economic problems lead to unemployment, which means that war veterans coming home from the war have no jobs. There's a lot of, disgruntled There are a lot of disgruntled veterans and disgruntled citizens and peasants in Italy at this time. Going through all of that trouble through World War I just to gain a bit of land in the north really didn't seem worth it to these people. So, since the government can't really deal effectively with this, fascism starts to look pretty good. So, fascism is an extreme right wing ideology which involves a dictator who supports the ownership of private property, who supports capitalism. But it's often state capitalism. It's all, everything is being done for the benefit of the state and the established order. So you still have social classes like rich, middle class, and poor, but the state still controls everything about all of those people's lives. So Benito Mussolini was a World War I veteran. He fought for Italy, and prior to that, he had actually been a school teacher himself. His mother had been a school teacher. His father was a blacksmith, so he comes from a working class family. He's really poor, and he was even a socialist. In fact, he also was the editor of a socialist paper in Italy before this. But then World War I happens, and the post-war Italy reality hits him in the face, and he switches sides. He goes from being a socialist to the extreme other end. He starts to really, fall in love with this idea of fascism. So he actually forms his own fascist party, the Fascio di Combattimento, in 1919, and they are a very violent group. They use a lot of thuggery and intimidation and fear. They are anti communist, they are anti strikes. So, one thing that the fascists don't want is they don't want the workers to go on strike in Italy because going on strike messes up production and it messes with profits and private property. So, they don't really believe in workers' rights. So, that's one way they really differ from communists. They're very nationalistic, very, extreme patriotism. For this reason, they win the support of the middle class. So even the middle class actually starts to look at the fascist party, despite the fact that they were pretty scary, because the middle class does not like the strikes that are taking place in Italy. They don't want the peasants and the poor to revolt in Italy. They think that the poor are part of the problem. They blame the poor for many of the problems in Italy. So the fascist party forms what are called the squadristi, literally a squad of fascist thugs that attack socialist presses. They would go any newspaper that was, considered to be socialist. What Mussolini might have called fake news, I guess you could say, gets smashed to smithereens, gets blown up. These squadristi were also known as the black shirts because of the uniforms that they wore. This actually results in Mussolini gaining some seats in parliament when his party actually, through an election process, even though it's a constitutional monarchy, Italy also has a parliament, and they gain some momentum in the parliament of Italy. People actually look at the black shirts and they're like, "Hey, those people get things done." So by the time we get to 1921, there were about 200,000 fascists in Italy. Most of them were war veterans and students. So this is an extremely nationalistic movement. They believed that terrorism was necessary, terror tactics were necessary, violence was necessary. And for that reason, they become seen as the party of order. One of the slogans that was said about Mussolini was, Mussolini made the trains run on time. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Italy, but Italian trains are notorious for constantly being late or the train service being disrupted because of railroad worker strikes. So when Mussolini comes to power, they say, oh, well, Mussolini made the trains run on time. They say that as if it's like some sort of miracle that in Italy the trains would run on time. So he decides that he's going to put on a show. In 1922, the Mussolini and the black shirts decide to literally march down the street in Rome near the palace. It's called the famous March on Rome in 1922 in October. This was done as a tactic of intimidation. They were armed. They were, kind of bombastic and very patriotic, and they put on this whole show. They were meant to look tough and scary. This actually makes me think now of like some of these armed protests against the quarantines that are taking place in some states. I don't know if you guys have seen those. But anyway, uh, Mussolini actually this tactic ends up working. The king of Italy himself, who is very discouraged because he can't seem to solve the problems in Italy himself, um, he actually goes ahead and he offers Mussolini the position of being prime minister. He figures, well, the people seem to like Mussolini and he appears to know what he's doing. So I'll make him the prime minister and maybe that will, score some popularity points for him. So on October 29th, Mussolini is appointed prime minister. The very next day, he decides to stage another march on Rome. And he does this to kind of create this illusion that the reason why Mussolini became prime minister was because of his show of force. Some people think he was bluffing when he first marched on Rome, but even if he was bluffing, it worked. So many people in Italy believed that Mussolini was very powerful and scary and frightening, and but he could get things done if he got the king to appoint him prime minister. So this is, by the way, the symbol of fascism. The word comes from the fasces, which is a Roman symbol. This comes back from the Roman Empire. It's a symbol of unity and strength. It's a bundle of sticks wrapped around an axe. So a bundle of sticks, when you tie them together, you can't break them. That represents the unity and the strength. And the axe, of course, represents force. Mussolini was very nationalistic, and he believed that he could make Italy great again. That he could make Italy into what the Roman Empire once had been. That he could bring the Roman Empire back, and Italy would relive those glory days. So in World War I, this is actually the area that Italy had gained. This right here, up in the north. This is the territory that Italy had gained from Austria. So Italy is now complete. So what is his new Italian fascist state like? Well, pretty soon he just gets rid of the rest of the parliament, and he just has only his fascist party in charge. So by the time we get to 1926, 3 years later, there's a complete fascist dictatorship with only the fascist party in charge. They create new policies, new laws. There's no more freedom of the press. The police are to watch everything. There are police spies everywhere. He has a complete political monopoly on the entire government. He does not need a government anyway. He doesn't need a parliament because he just rules by decree. He says, there's an emergency and I'm going to enact such and such law, and he does it. There's also massive propaganda everywhere, and propaganda is in the schools, it's in the papers, it's in the movies. He wants to mold Italians into a single community that all think the same. He creates the Young Fascists, which is a youth organization in Italy for all young men to join. And in schools, all children were taught to be young fascists, and the slogan that children were taught to repeat literally was "Mussolini is always right." He also had a very weird attitudes toward women. Mussolini believed that a woman's job was to breed strong sons, was to essentially have as many children as possible and populate what would become the new Italian empire. So women were taught to be wives and mothers and have children, and they were rewarded for having um, as many children as they possibly could. One woman famously earned a gold medal for having 14 babies. He believed that the family itself would be the pillar of the state, meaning that the family unit was the most important part of the state of Italy. So men and women were encouraged to marry and have as many children as possible, um, and assume traditional roles. This was exercised even in schools, as schoolboys. Their most important class was physical education, where they would learn certain exercises, and they would actually have to repeat these exercise drills and all moving in unison. So think about how creepy that is. That in PE class, you are taught to do a certain drill of like calisthenics and jumps, and stretches and everything, and everyone is moving, doing the exact same movement at the exact same time to the point where you don't even have to think about it. That was very symbolic of what Italy was for Mussolini. Everybody is the same, everybody thinks the same, everybody's brainwashed to do the same thing and believe the same thing. Now, I should say, while Mussolini was successful, he never really does achieve the degree of control that Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union are able to achieve. He had to compromise with a whole bunch of other traditional institutions. For example, the Catholic Church, which is what the Lateran Accords from 1929 are about. So the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany didn't have to deal with that. They didn't have to deal with the Catholic Church sort of overseeing the country. And in Italy, people were very attached to the Catholic faith. So there is that one obstacle to his power. But here he is. He's the one in white. As you can see, Mussolini is also seen as a very sort of tough and manly, masculine dude. His nickname was Il Duce, or the Iron Duce, the strong leader who is always right. This is one of his favorite images of himself. If you Google Mussolini giving a speech, you'll see how loud and intimidating he was, even when he spoke. He yelled a lot. He pounded his fists. Uh, he got people riled up pretty easily. So I'm going to show you guys. Go back to the video to the primary source here. So the Doctrine of Fascism by Benito Mussolini is where he basically outlines what the whole point of fascism is, and I'd like to do a little bit of reading here from it. So if you read the introduction, I'll start reading it out loud. Italy was the first European power to turn to fascism. The country was one of the victors in World War I, but the war was costly and Italy did not gain much. After the war, the country was marked by instability, weak governments, and an apparent threat from the left. Benito Mussolini, a former leader of the Socialist Party and a veteran of the war, organized the Italian Fascist Party in 1919. Strongly nationalistic, the party stood against the Versailles Treaty, left-wing radicalism, and the established government. After leading his black shirts on a march on Rome in 1922, Mussolini was invited by King Victor Emmanuel to form a government. Over the next few years, Mussolini effectively eliminated any opposition and installed his fascist state system, which would last some 20 years. The following document contains excerpts from the political social doctrine of fascism, signed by Mussolini and written with the philosopher Giovanni Gentile, that originally appeared in the Encyclopedia Italiana in 1932. It describes the ideological foundations of Italian fascism. These excerpts emphasize the rejection of traditional democracy, liberalism, and socialism, as well as faith in the authoritarian fascist state. Okay, so again, fascism is a rejection of liberalism and a rejection of traditional democracy, even though, ironically enough, democracy often is what gave way to this. In a democratic government, people can literally vote their freedoms away if they vote for such a leader. So, something interesting to think about in our very strange crisis-driven times. These are Mussolini's own words, and here in this first paragraph, he describes what fascism is and what is the point of it. Fascism, the more it considers and observes the future and the development of humanity quite apart from political considerations of the moment, believes neither in the possibility nor in the utility of perpetual peace. It thus repudiates the doctrine of pacifism, born of a renunciation of the struggle and an act of cowardice in the face of sacrifice. War alone brings up to its highest tension all human energy and puts the stamp of nobility upon the people who have the courage to meet it. Okay, so what does this mean? Essentially, Mussolini is saying war is good. Peace is for wimps. Peace is for the weak. Peace is cowardly. War requires sacrifice and greatness and struggle, which makes us stronger. So fascism actually thrives on war. So as you can probably tell, Mussolini is itching for a war. He's he's anxious to see one start. He wants Italy to redeem itself, I guess you could say, and believes that war is what will strengthen Italy. Interestingly enough, World War II does strengthen some countries, like America. which is because it ends the depression, but it destroys others. The fascist accepts life and loves it, knowing nothing of and despising suicide. He rather conceives of life as duty and struggle and conquest, life which should be high and full, lived for oneself, but above all for others, those who are at hand and those who are far distant, contemporaries, and those who will come after. So this is an interesting way of looking at life. He says fascists love life, but for that reason, suicide is considered a very unfascist idea, whatever that means. But he believes that um, the reason why you should live is or a life lived to the fullest is a life of struggle and conquest, of sacrifice. And he also believes that you shouldn't just live your life for you, but for everyone else. You have to live it for those in the past, our ancestors, those who are present, our contemporaries, and those who will come after, the future generations. So, in other words, you should sacrifice your life for that. An interesting way to look at it, since many of them will be sacrificing their lives. The next paragraph. Such a conception of life makes fascism the complete opposite of that doctrine, the base of so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the materialistic conception of history. Fascism, now and always, believes in holiness and in heroism, that is to say, in actions influenced by no economic motive, direct or indirect. So he makes an interesting accusation against Marxist socialism. He believes that Marxism is too financially or economically motivated, whereas fascism is not. Fascism is just for the greatness and the holiness and the heroism of the state itself. Interesting to note, by the way, fascism does obviously favor the ownership of private property and private capital, but it must still benefit the state. Fascism repudiates the conception of economic happiness to be realized by socialism and, as it were, a given moment in economic evolution to assure to everyone the maximum of well-being. Fascism denies the materialist conception of happiness as a possibility and abandons to it its inventors, the economists of the first half of the 19th century. So it's interesting how he believes that fascists don't believe that any kind of economic solutions or redistribution of wealth will make anyone happy. What will make you happy is the greatness of the state itself. After socialism, fascism combats the whole complex system of democratic ideology and repudiates it, whether in its theoretical premises or in its practical application. Fascism denies that the majority, by the simple fact that it is a majority, can direct human society. It denies that numbers alone can govern by means of a periodical consultation, and it affirms the immutable, beneficial, and fruitful inequality of mankind, which can never be permanently leveled through the mere operation of a mechanical process such as universal suffrage. Okay, so here he's basically talking about how democratic ideology is stupid because the whole democratic ideology tries to make people equal. But basically, he's saying fascists don't believe in equality. In fact, equality itself is bad. There is inequality amongst people. Some people are better than others. Some people are weaker than others, and the weak have to be allowed to die off, whereas the strong go on to procreate. There's that sort of influence of social Darwinism again. He calls it, in fact, he says that the inequality of mankind is beneficial and fruitful, and it can never be permanently leveled through the mere operation of a mechanical process such as universal suffrage. In other words, he's saying you can vote all you want, but that's not going to make us equal. Interesting. Okay. Next paragraph. Fascism denies in democracy the absurd conventional untruth of political equality dressed out in the garb of collective irresponsibility and the myth of happiness and indefinite progress. But if democracy may be conceived in diverse forms, that is to say, taking democracy to mean a state of society. Sorry, bug on my computer. That is to say, taking democracy to mean a state of society in which the populace are not reduced to impotence in the state, Fascism may write itself down as an organized, centralized, and authoritative democracy. It's a very twisted way of looking at it, right? First he says that democracy is terrible and is stupid, but then he says, well, fascism actually can be considered a sort of centralized and authoritative democracy, so long as you choose fascism, which is not really democracy at all, right? Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, guys. I think you guys can read the rest of it on your own. But it is important to note, of course, that when you go back and you look at my website, that people have very different beliefs about fascism. Here are my big, AP Euro quotes on my board here about what fascism is. Mussolini believed fascism is a religious concept. It's something you must believe in with your entire being and give yourself over to. Lenin hates fascism, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Soviet Union, and he believes that fascism is just capitalism in decay. It's capitalism dying. And that leads us to fascism. It's an interesting way to look at it as well. Hitler, who of course very much believes in fascism, he believes that fascism must be driven, of course, in large part by propaganda. You have to make people believe in it. So he's famous for saying, make the lie big, make it simple, keep repeating it, and eventually they will believe it. Something to keep in mind in today's day and age, as we have politicians who also like to repeat big and simple lies often for the benefit of themselves. This happens all over the world, even today. So, guys, I'm going to leave you there. I'm going to have you guys comment on the essential questions below. And tomorrow we will talk about the rise of Adolf Hitler.